Penrose, Colorado. Population, just over 3,000. The kind of place where everyone waves hello, news spreads fast, and peace is part of the daily rhythm. A town so quiet, you'd never imagine what lay behind a pair of locked doors on the outskirts of town. But peace was a lie. On October 4th, 2023, a tip came in. An anonymous complaint about a foul odor, one that had lingered far too long. Authorities responded. They expected maybe a refrigeration failure. A small error. They opened the doors and walked into a nightmare. Inside, they found decay, chaos, death in piles. Nearly 200 human bodies stacked, rotting, decomposing in a space meant for reverence and rest. Some had been there for weeks, others for years. This was no accident. This was deliberate betrayal. Families who had trusted returned to nature to care for their loved ones were now grappling with a devastating truth. They may have buried empty urns filled with dust or concrete. They may have grieved a lie. The perpetrators? Jon and Carie Hess, owners of the funeral home, now accused of hundreds of counts of abuse, fraud, and desecration. This wasn't just fraud. This was a funeral home of horrors, and the story would shock the nation.
Welcome to Crime Bite.
In this channel, we peel back the layers of those hidden realities, raw evidence, conflicting testimonies, and emotional pleas for help that too often come too late. By looking into these crime bites, you'll see firsthand how broken trust, systemic oversights, and chilling motives can converge into stories that rattle us to the core. If you find this exploration as vital as we do, be sure to like this video, subscribe, and click the notifications button. Together, we can shine a light on the cases that demand attention, ensuring every voice, especially the silenced, finds the audience it deserves. In the quaint town of Penrose, Colorado, population barely over 3,000, the air once carried the earthy scents of high desert sagebrush and distant pine. But by the fall of 2023, something had shifted. Locals began to whisper about a strange odor, a heavy, sour presence that clung to the wind and wouldn't let go. It wasn't the stench of livestock or a long-dead animal. This was different. This was wrong. At first, people chalked it up to paranoia or weather shifts. But the unease was real, thick and pressing. Behind the closed doors of the Return to Nature funeral home, the truth festered, quite literally. It wasn't until a green biohazard team in full hazmat suits pried open the doors that the nightmare began to take shape. Inside, stacked like firewood, lay body after body, unembalmed, unrefrigerated, left to rot. This was no clerical error. This was horror disguised as business. How could nearly 200 bodies be abandoned in plain sight without anyone noticing for months? When Jon and Carie Hess opened Return to Nature Funeral Home in 2017, their mission sounded heartfelt: provide eco-friendly, affordable burials in a natural setting. No harsh chemicals, no unnecessary expenses, just respect, simplicity, and peace. It resonated deeply in Colorado, where environmental values often guide lifestyle choices, even in death. Families were relieved to find a funeral home that promised dignity without high costs. They trusted Jon and Carie with their most precious goodbyes. The couple spoke gently, offered tea during consultations, and hugged clients as they handed over urns. But behind the soothing words and framed certificates, a darker reality was festering. A broken refrigeration unit, a refusal to pay for repairs, corners being cut, then hacked away entirely. The couple took in bodies they never processed, collected payments they never honored, and sent ashes that didn't belong to anyone's loved ones. The public wouldn't learn the scale of the deception until it was far too late. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your opinions in the comment section. What happens when compassion becomes a costume and trust is the currency of betrayal? By the summer of 2023, the rumors began to spread. An odd smell, strange behavior. A building that should have bustled with respectful silence now stood still and shuddered. When asked, the Hallfords claimed they had moved storage to another facility. They said it was all within industry standards, but the odor didn't lie. People started reporting it to the Fremont County Sheriff's Office. And finally, in early October, a search warrant was issued. What deputies discovered inside defied description. 190 decaying human bodies, stacked in various states of decomposition. The facility had no working refrigeration. Some bodies had been there for over 2 years. Forensics teams needed weeks to identify all the remains. Families began receiving calls that shook them to their core. Some had already scattered what they believed were their loved ones' ashes. Now they were being told those ashes belonged to strangers. Can grief ever be healed when it's violated twice, once by death and again by deception? In a disturbing twist, investigators learned that John Halford had been sending out fake ashes. Instead of cremating the bodies entrusted to them, the Halfords stored them like trash and distributed urns filled with dry concrete mix or burned firewood. Forensic tests confirmed what families feared. They had held ceremonies, cried into urns, and buried symbolic remnants that held no connection to their loved ones. One woman told reporters she had poured her husband's ashes into a river they both loved, only to find out days later that he had never been cremated at all. His body was one of the many recovered from the Penrose building. This wasn't mismanagement. This was betrayal of the highest order. How do you grieve again when the first farewell was a lie? Hit the button and like, subscribe, and comment. On November 8th, 2023, Jon and Carie Halford were arrested in Oklahoma. They were staying in a hotel under assumed names, apparently trying to flee charges. Authorities charged them with over 250 criminal counts, including abuse of a corpse, fraud, and theft. The arrest brought temporary relief to grieving families, but it couldn't undo the damage. Court documents revealed that the couple had racked up hundreds of thousands of dollars in unpaid taxes and had defaulted on several business loans. Their motive, prosecutors argued, was simple: greed. The Halfords had turned death into a profitable lie, using grief as a gateway for exploitation. Should justice be measured in prison time when the emotional toll is immeasurable? The echo of disbelief had barely begun to settle when grieving families were called together. Not for a memorial, but for a reckoning. In Penrose, the town hall became a cathedral of grief. Seats filled with stunned mourners who had buried their loved ones twice now, once in ceremony and now again in betrayal. They clutched the photographs that had once brought comfort. But now, those smiling faces were accompanied by a new question. Where is their body really? A woman stepped up to the microphone, her voice cracked before she even spoke. I held the urn for years. I kissed it goodnight. I thought it was my dad. She held up a small, decorative jar. I don't even know what's in here. Another man stood behind her, stone-faced and silent. He couldn't find the words, but the picture he held of his late wife said enough. Her soft smile, frozen in time, now tainted by the horror of what might have happened to her remains. Some families were too overwhelmed to speak. Others could barely stop. Calls were made, not just for healing but for justice. Why was there no inspection system? How could hundreds of bodies rot in a facility without a single authority stepping in? Where was the oversight? This wasn't just about one crime. This was about a system, or the lack of one. Funeral homes in some states operated with shocking autonomy, and Return to Nature took full advantage of the trust that comes with death. Now families were left demanding reforms, not only to punish the Halfords, but to protect others from the same unthinkable agony. They were no longer just mourners. They had become advocates, activists, and voices for the voiceless. Is closure even possible when your final goodbye was stolen from you? Penrose, Colorado had never made national headlines before. A quiet town, cradled in the shadows of the Rockies, where people trusted their neighbors and believed in decency. But overnight, Penrose became a crime scene, and the site of a collective heartbreak. The discovery of nearly 200 decomposing bodies inside the Return to Nature funeral home sent shockwaves not just through the town, but across the state and the country. It wasn't just the number, it was the scale of betrayal. This wasn't a single oversight or a tragic accident. It was a massive, systematic failure that spanned years. Families who once proudly displayed urns on fireplaces, who spread ashes in rivers or kept lockets close to their hearts, were now tormented by doubt. What had they really been given? Investigations revealed some urns contained nothing at all. Others held fireplace soot, quick-mix cement, or even crushed drywall. The Halfords hadn't just mishandled the bodies. They'd manufactured lies and sold them as sacred goodbyes. Local news stations were inundated with interviews. One father gritted his teeth through tears. I buried my son. I gave a eulogy. Now I don't even know where he is. Another family admitted they couldn't bring themselves to tell their elderly mother. She's 92. We can't tell her she kissed a fake urn every night for 5 years. Support hotlines rang non-stop. Churches opened their doors for grief counseling. Entire neighborhoods hosted healing circles. But no amount of community support could erase the burning question: how did this happen, and why didn't anyone stop it sooner? The betrayal was existential. It shook faith in the very institutions meant to provide peace at life's most painful edge. In small towns like Penrose, trust is everything. And now that trust lay rotting, like the bodies inside the funeral home freezer. The Return to Nature building was now abandoned, boarded up, surrounded by crime scene tape and a makeshift memorial of flowers, signs, and tears. When our most sacred rituals are violated, how do we reclaim dignity for the living and the dead? The nightmare didn't end with discovery. It was only beginning. As investigators stepped into the once trusted walls of the Return to Nature funeral home, they were greeted not by silence, but by the pungent, gut-wrenching odor of decay. That smell would follow them home in their clothes, their hair, and their dreams. This wasn't just a crime scene. It was a mass grave with a roof. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, and local law enforcement formed a joint task force. They set up portable labs outside the building and began the painstaking task of sorting, identifying, and cataloging over 190 human remains in various states of decomposition. Some were mummified, others were reduced to bone. A few, horrifyingly, were still in early stages of decay, complete with flies and larvae. Each discovery raised a new question. How long had this been going on? One detective was overheard saying, "I've never seen anything like this in my entire career." Another whispered, "This is a house of horrors." It wasn't just the physical remains that told the story. Documents found inside were damning. Investigators uncovered a chaotic mix of fake death certificates, forged signatures, and falsified invoices. Many paid in full by families who were never given what they thought they received. The black box of corruption had burst open. Each file folder represented a human life, a person who was mourned, honored, and buried, or so their loved ones believed. One receipt showed a family paid nearly $5,000 for cremation and an urn that likely contained nothing but powdered concrete. Another file showed the same body listed as cremated and prepared for burial under different names. This wasn't sloppy bookkeeping. This was premeditated fraud at the expense of the dead. Criminal charges began to stack like bricks. Abuse of a corpse, over 190 counts. Wire fraud for each transaction where families were deceived. Forgery, theft, obstruction, falsification of records, and more. Each charge brought more anguish for the victims' families. But it also meant something else. The Hesses could no longer hide. The question remained, how did this continue for so long without detection? How did a building full of rotting human bodies sit undisturbed for months, even years, before anyone opened the door? That question would echo in the courtroom soon enough. How long does evil have to hide in plain sight before someone dares to open the door? The day Jon and Carie Hess were arrested, the community of Penrose exhaled, but not in relief. The breath they released was grief recycled as fury. The trial that followed wasn't just a legal proceeding. It was a communal reckoning. For weeks, the courtroom became the beating heart of a town and a nation, trying to make sense of something utterly senseless. The prosecution wasted no time painting the Hesses not as desperate business owners, but as calculated manipulators. They called it a business of death built on deceit. Each exhibit laid out with surgical precision photos of the decomposing bodies, surveillance footage showing no delivery trucks ever arriving with cremated remains, emails with chilling phrases like, "Can you tell them it's delayed? Make something up." Witnesses took the stand, dozens of them. One by one, grieving families shared their stories. A father who kissed his wife's urn goodnight every night, now unsure what it ever held. A daughter who poured ashes into the sea, only to be told they may have been not even human remains. A pastor who gave eulogies, now unsure if the casket beneath him was filled with anything at all. The defense tried to argue that the funeral home had suffered financial hardship, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, that they were overwhelmed, under-resourced, that the situation spiraled out of control before they could fix it. But it was too little, too late. The jury didn't buy it. They saw intention, not error, deception, not desperation. The verdict, guilty, on nearly every count. When the sentencing came, The courtroom fell into a breathless hush. The judge did not mince words. You desecrated the sacred. You violated the public trust. You turned funerals into forgeries. The Hesses were sentenced to decades behind bars. No possibility of parole for most charges. For many, it still didn't feel like enough. Some families hugged in quiet relief. Others walked out without a word, the weight of years of compounded grief still too heavy to lift. Justice had arrived, but the wounds, they remained open. Can a courtroom truly deliver justice when the dead were robbed of dignity and the living robbed of truth? The tragedy left a scar on Penrose and on funeral industry trust nationwide. Colorado lawmakers fast-tracked new legislation for better oversight. But for the families, no law could bring back the sacred moments that had been stolen. Support groups continued to meet. Lawsuits were filed. Memorial services were reheld. But the pain remains. Return to Nature was shut down, its doors locked, its windows boarded. But the echoes of what happened inside that building still ring through the hearts of those left behind. How do you begin to heal when mourning must start all over again? This was more than a true crime story. It was a community's worst nightmare. It was about trust broken, grief twisted, and dignity stolen. But in truth, it's about resilience too. About families coming together to reclaim the honor of their loved ones. Like if you believe dignity in death should never be compromised. Comment if you know someone impacted by the funeral home system. Your story could help others. Subscribe and click the notification bell for more haunting true crime cases that demand answers, accountability, and justice.